You are not a real opponent. This will be over in seconds. You are not a real opponent. This will be over in seconds.
Let us compete. Then you will know.
Easy money, Natalie Brooks said, her voice carrying across Harbor Point Athletic Center as the livestream camera swung toward the man repairing a loose railing beside the western bleachers. Hundreds of spectators turned with it, and Marcus Bennett's face appeared on the giant screen above the court before he had even looked up from his wrench. 8-year-old Sophie saw the faded gray maintenance shirt, the worn work boots, and the quiet expression she knew better than anyone magnified for the entire arena to judge. Natalie stood at the center of the blue mat in a spotless white uniform, one hand resting near the black belt at her waist. 2 minutes, she said. Stay on the mat with me for 2 minutes, and the youth program gets $10,000. Applause rolled through the building. Marcus calmly tightened the final bolt and tested the railing with one hand. I'm working, he said. Calvin Price watched the livestream count climb on the monitor beside the control table and gave Natalie a small circular motion with 2 fingers, the signal to keep the moment moving. The audience loves an honest challenge, he said into the microphone. Then, lowering it only slightly, he added, and Harbor Point remembers which employees support its biggest events. Marcus met his eyes but did not answer. Natalie smiled toward the cameras, still believing she was creating the uplifting moment Calvin had promised the sponsors. No pressure, she said, though $10,000 must be worth more than a few months of fixing handrails. Laughter scattered through the front rows. Sophie's hand tightened around the strap of her purple backpack. Marcus placed the wrench inside his toolbox. Find another volunteer. Natalie's smile faltered for only a second. Then she noticed Sophie beneath the giant screen. Your father has every right to say no, she told the girl. But sometimes staying calm is courage, and sometimes it is just a comfortable way to hide fear. Sophie looked at Marcus, not ashamed of him, but uncertain why the room suddenly treated his silence like a confession. Marcus stepped away from the railing and positioned himself between his daughter and the nearest camera. His eyes passed once over the south exit, the control station, and the crowded aisle below the western bleachers. A faint metallic click sounded somewhere above the spectators. No one reacted. Marcus looked up for half a second, then back at Natalie. 2 minutes, he said, and you leave my daughter out of it. The arena erupted. Calvin glanced at the rising viewer count and smiled. Marcus removed his watch and placed it in Sophie's palm. Hold this for me. She closed both hands around it. No one in that building knew the man in the maintenance shirt had once answered to a name that made experienced men stop talking and start listening. Marcus stepped onto the mat with his shoulders loose and his hands open. He did not watch Natalie's fists. His attention settled on her shoulders, her hips, and the foot carrying her weight. Near the back row, Thomas Grant stopped clapping when he saw how Marcus placed his feet. Natalie moved without warning, fast enough to draw a gasp from the crowd. Marcus shifted several inches before her motion was complete, leaving her facing empty space. Thomas leaned forward, the color slowly leaving his face, while high above the western bleachers, metal clicked a second time. Did you ever promise someone you would bring them home and fail? Sophie asked. Several hours earlier, Marcus Bennett stood barefoot in the narrow kitchen of their Virginia Beach apartment, holding a purple ribbon between his fingers while his 8-year-old daughter watched him through the reflection in the microwave door. The question made his hands pause. On the table beside her sat an open notebook titled The Bravest Person I Know, with Marcus Bennett written carefully beneath it and nothing else. Morning light crossed the refrigerator, catching the edge of a framed photograph of Danielle laughing on a windy beach while Marcus carried a much younger Sophie on his shoulders. Marcus tied the ribbon the way Danielle had once shown him, looping it twice so it would stay through the day. That is a heavy question before breakfast, he said. Sophie did not smile. You said brave people keep promises. Marcus looked at the notebook. Brave people still get scared, he said. They just remember who needs them. Sophie tapped her pencil against the blank page. Is that why I picked you? You picked me because your assignment is due Monday and I make pancakes. You burned them last week. That was one time. She finally smiled, but her eyes remained on him. Marcus reached for his old watch on the counter. The scratched metal back carried two small initials Sophie had noticed before but never understood. DM. His thumb rested over them for a moment. There are promises people carry even after they cannot fix them, he said quietly. Sophie waited for more. Marcus fastened the watch around his wrist and closed the subject with the gentleness of someone shutting a door, not locking it. But I come back to you. Every time. Her expression softened. Before she could ask another question, Marcus's phone rang. Their babysitter sounded exhausted and apologized between coughs, leaving him with no choice but to take Sophie to Harbor Point Athletic Center while he worked the Saturday charity event. Sophie insisted she did not mind. She packed her notebook, allergy medicine, and purple backpack while Marcus checked the maintenance schedule folded beside his keys. Most of the morning inspection boxes had been signed, but the line for the Western lighting and camera rig remained blank. A handwritten note beside it read "Final load, check pending." Marcus studied it for a second, then slipped the schedule under his arm. It was incomplete, not necessarily dangerous, but incomplete things had a way of becoming someone else's emergency. At Harbor Point, he paused long enough to move a stack of folding chairs away from the south emergency exit, then looked up at the suspended rig above the western bleachers. Technicians were still attaching a camera mount, while Calvin Price spoke to a sponsor near the court. Marcus filed the image away and took Sophie to a seat near the railing he had been assigned to repair. She opened her notebook again. I still do not know what to write, she said. Marcus tested the loose rail. Write what you know. Sophie looked at his worn work shirt, the lunch he had packed, and the ribbon that had not come. Loose. I know you stay, she said. Marcus glanced at her, but before he could answer, the crowd erupted. Music swelled, phones rose, and Natalie Brooks stepped onto the mat beneath the giant screen. Sophie looked up just as the camera swung away from the champion and found her father beside the bleachers. Marcus Bennett's face filled the screen, and Calvin Price lifted the microphone. If this stream drops again, they walk, Calvin Price said without looking away from the viewer count climbing beside the control table. Natalie Brooks kept her smile fixed for the cameras, but her fingers tightened once against the edge of her black belt. Across the court, one of the sponsor representatives had stopped watching the mat and was scrolling through her phone. Years earlier, an instructor had told Natalie she would need to train twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. She had built a career by refusing to disappear when other people expected her to, but now every silent screen and distracted sponsor felt like a door beginning to close. Did you get the crowd reaction? She asked quietly. Calvin checked the replay monitor. Not enough of it. A young technician approached with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Mr. Price, the final load check on the Western lighting and camera rig still needs a signature. Calvin glanced toward the suspended equipment above the bleachers, then at the countdown clock for the live stream. We go live in 4 minutes. Finish the visual check and bring it back after the demonstration. The technician hesitated. The added camera mount changed the load. Then confirm it after we have an audience, Calvin said, already turning away. He lowered his voice as Natalie stepped closer. We need a human moment. Something people cannot scroll past. His eyes moved across the gym and settled on Marcus Bennett repairing the railing near his daughter. Marcus was tall enough to make a challenge look credible. His maintenance shirt made the contrast immediate, and nothing in the event record suggested any competitive background. He looked strong, Calvin said, but ordinary. A working father, a real crowd, a harmless challenge. Sponsors love. Relatable. Natalie followed his gaze. Has he agreed? Not yet. Calvin smiled as though the distinction did not matter. Once everyone is watching, most people would rather step forward than explain why they will not. Natalie noticed Sophie beside the bleachers, purple backpack at her feet, notebook open on her knees. For one brief moment, Natalie imagined how the scene would look from the child's seat instead of through a camera lens. Leave the girl out of it, she said. Calvin's attention remained on the monitor. Of course. But when Marcus refused and the crowd's energy began to fade, Natalie saw Calvin make the smallest circling motion with 2 fingers. Keep it moving. She looked once towards Sophie before speaking again, and the hesitation should have stopped her. Instead, she let the silence, the sponsor banners, and the glowing livestream count make the decision for her. Now Marcus stood across from her on the mat, calm in a way the earlier volunteers had not been. He did not stare at her hands. His eyes moved from her shoulders to her balance. then briefly to the south exit and Sophie's position near the western bleachers. Natalie shifted her rhythm and stepped in, expecting the delayed reaction of an untrained man. Marcus moved only a few inches, but he moved before her weight had fully changed. The audience laughed in surprise. Natalie told herself it was luck. Near the back row, Thomas Grant leaned forward and stopped smiling. Natalie reset her stance, added a false movement through her shoulders, and changed direction without warning. Marcus was already gone from the space she had chosen. Thomas's gaze dropped to Marcus's feet. "That is not tournament training," he whispered. "You can stop running," Natalie said, resetting her stance as the crowd's uncertain laughter faded into a restless murmur. Marcus did not answer at once. His eyes moved past her to Sophie, who sat near the western bleachers with his watch enclosed in both hands. And for one suspended second, the bright court dissolved into a quiet hospital room for years earlier. "She cannot lose both of us," Danielle had whispered. Sunlight rested across her hands above the white blanket. While Sophie slept curled in a chair beside the window, too young to understand why her mother's voice had become so soft. A kitchen calendar lay open on the bedside table. Each day Marcus had promised to return marked in Danielle's careful handwriting. He had spent 12 years learning how to enter uncertain places, stay clear when others panicked, and guide people toward a way out. Yet sitting beside his wife, he had finally understood that returning through the front door was not the same as being present for the life waiting behind it. Danielle had looked from him to their sleeping daughter. She needs a father she does not have to keep waiting for. A burst of applause pulled Marcus back to Harbor Point as Natalie stepped toward him again. He shifted just enough to leave her facing open space, never raising his hands, never turning the moment into the contest the cameras wanted. To the audience, his restraint still resembled hesitation. To Thomas Grant, watching from the back row, it was something else entirely. Distance measured without looking, balance preserved without force, choices made before pressure could turn into panic. Natalie circled him, frustrated by the absence of fear in his face. "You agreed to 2 minutes," she said. "Standing near the edge does not count." Marcus heard her, but another voice moved beneath hers, broken by static and years. "Bring them home." His thumb brushed the scratched back of his watch in Sophie's hands, where the initials DM had been worn shallow into the metal. For an instant, he remembered reaching through darkness toward a hand that was no longer there. The memory vanished before it could fully take shape, leaving only the promise he had carried out of that hospital room. Danielle had not asked him to become less capable. She had asked him to remember what his capability was for. Natalie advanced again, expecting anger, pride, anything she could use. Marcus stepped away from her line and placed himself closer to Sophie's side of the mat. "You can stop running," Natalie repeated, louder now so the microphones would catch it. Marcus looked at his daughter. Sophie remembered the kitchen that morning, the blank essay. "Paige," in his quiet words, "I come back to you. Every time." "I am not running," Marcus said. His voice remained level. "I am keeping a promise." Sophie lowered her eyes to the watch and understood. Natalie did not. To her, the answer sounded like another refusal to acknowledge the challenge, another calm sentence that made the room question who truly controlled it. Her breathing changed. She shifted her rear foot half an inch, lowered one shoulder, and stopped looking toward the sponsor representative. Thomas rose slowly from his seat. The next movement would not be for applause. Natalie was no longer trying to entertain the crowd. She was trying to force Marcus to become the man she had already told everyone he was. "Give them something worth watching," Calvin said, his eyes fixed on the livestream count climbing beside the control table. Natalie's breathing changed before her feet did. Marcus saw it in the slight lift of her shoulders, the shift of weight toward her back leg, and the way her attention flicked toward the sponsor representative standing beyond the cameras. She stepped in quickly, expecting him to retreat too far or freeze under the pressure of the crowd. Marcus moved barely 3 inches. Natalie passed the space where he had been, caught herself cleanly, and turned as laughter rippled through the front rows. To most of the audience, it looked like luck. Natalie wanted to believe the same thing. Thomas Grant did not laugh. He had watched Marcus move before Natalie's heel had fully settled, not after. The older man leaned forward, studying the quiet maintenance worker as though a forgotten memory had just taken shape. Natalie adjusted her stance and offered the cameras a confident smile. Once can happen to anyone, she said. Marcus gave no answer. His eyes passed briefly over the western bleachers, the south exit, and the children seated near Sophie before returning to Natalie's shoulders. High above them, a support cable beside the suspended camera frame trembled once and became still. No one else appeared to notice. Natalie changed her approach. This time she moved from an angle, faster and with less warning, trying to force Marcus toward the edge of the mat. He turned with her motion instead of resisting it. For one brief second, Natalie felt her balance disappear. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her, and she understood before the audience did that Marcus could have allowed the moment to finish badly. Instead, his open hand steadied her upper arm and guided her back onto both feet. The contact lasted less than a second. From the bleachers came a scattered wave of surprised applause, as though Marcus had simply recovered from a mistake. Natalie knew better. He had protected her from falling in front of every camera in the building. She stepped away, unsettled by the mercy more than she would have been by humiliation. Marcus released her immediately and lowered his hands. "You do not have to prove anything to them," he said quietly. Natalie looked toward the sponsor banners and the glowing viewer count. "Do not tell me what I need." Calvin saw the numbers climbing and made the same small, circling motion with his fingers. "Keep going." Natalie caught the signal. Her next movement carried more urgency than the earlier exchanges, less demonstration and more demand. Marcus shifted once, but she followed, cutting off the space he had used before. The audience stopped laughing. Shoes whispered against the mat. Camera shutters clicked in quick succession. Sophie sat motionless near the western bleachers. Marcus's watch closed inside her palm. She noticed that her father was no longer watching Natalie alone. Between each movement, his attention returned to the children, the exit aisle, and the rig overhead. A light above the western section flickered, steadied, then flickered again. Marcus heard a faint metallic click beneath the applause. Natalie moved closer, trying to draw fear, frustration, anything that would make the moment look like the contest Calvin had promised. Marcus kept the distance safe. "This stopped being a demonstration when you needed me to be afraid," he said. The words were low enough that only Natalie heard them. Her expression tightened. "You think you know me?" "No," Marcus said. "I think you stopped listening to yourself." Natalie glanced toward the sponsor representative, then came forward again. This time Marcus did not simply move away. He redirected her wrist, stepped outside her line of balance, and brought the exchange to a complete stop without force. Natalie found herself standing still, one shoulder turned, her balance held in a position she could not recover from without his permission. Marcus had not twisted her arm or caused pain. He had simply removed every useful option. The arena went silent. Even Calvin lowered the microphone. For one suspended moment, everyone understood that Marcus could end the challenge whenever he chose. Thomas rose from his seat and moved closer to the floor. This was not tournament timing. It was control designed to prevent panic, injury, and escalation. Natalie felt the truth of it more clearly than anyone. The man she had selected because he looked ordinary was protecting her again, this time from the full consequence of her own decision. "Dad," Sophie said. Her voice was soft, but Marcus heard it immediately. He released Natalie and stepped back. She turned, breathing harder now, not from effort, but from the sudden collapse of certainty. A few spectators began murmuring. Others looked from Natalie to Marcus, unsure who had won the exchange. Marcus was no longer looking at either of them. His eyes had lifted toward the western rig. The support cable moved again, this time with a visible shiver. Thomas heard the second metallic click and followed Marcus's gaze. Near the control station, the young technician looked up from the clipboard. A small fastener dropped from above, struck the floor near the edge of the mat, and spun in a tight silver circle before falling flat. Marcus watched it stop. Then he looked toward the families seated beneath the rig. "Stop the event," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the western lighting and camera rig suspended above the bleachers. The room had not yet understood that the challenge was over. Natalie still stood near the center of the mat. Calvin still held the microphone, and the live stream count continued climbing beside the control table. Marcus pointed toward the western section. "Cut power to that rig. Clear those bleachers toward the south exit." Calvin followed his gaze but saw only lights, camera equipment, and a steel frame hanging nearly 30 feet above the crowd. "We have less than 2 minutes left," he said. The morning inspection was almost complete. Almost as not complete. Marcus moved toward the edge of the mat. The support cable near the added camera mount no longer ran straight. Its angle had changed under the extra load, and the small fastener that had fallen near the mat had come from the same Western connection. Marcus did not need a dramatic failure to know something was wrong. He repaired equipment for a living. He knew how weight traveled through a frame, how metal warned before it shifted, and how an unsigned inspection line could turn a small oversight into a crowded room emergency. The young technician near the control station looked down at the clipboard in his hands. The final load check remained blank, exactly as it had that morning. "Mr. Price," he said, "the added camera mount was never signed off." Calvin lowered the microphone. The visual check was done. Stopping the stream now could create panic, and we have sponsor representatives in the room. His reasoning was not careless in his own mind. He believed the frame would hold for another few minutes, that keeping people calm meant keeping the program moving, and that shutting everything down on the word of a maintenance employee would damage an event he had spent months building. Natalie looked from the rig to Marcus. "You cannot end this because the room stopped cheering for you," she said, but the accusation lost strength as soon as she spoke it. Marcus was not looking at her. He was counting the families seated beneath the western rig, measuring the distance to the south exit, and checking where Sophie sat with his watch in her hands. "This is not about the challenge," he said. Calvin stepped closer, keeping his voice low enough that the crowd could not hear. "Walk off this event on camera, and I cannot protect your position Monday." Marcus finally looked at him. The threat was wrapped in professional language, but its meaning was clear. Losing this job would mean rent, groceries, Sophie's school expenses, and a life he had built carefully enough that his daughter never had to wonder whether the next month would hold. Sophie watched him from the bleachers. She could not hear Calvin, but she saw the pause. Marcus looked at her for one quiet second, then stepped off the mat. Boos rose from the crowd. Calvin lifted the microphone and tried to recover the moment, announcing a brief reset while Natalie remained standing beneath the lights. She heard people calling Marcus afraid, yet the victory she had wanted felt strangely hollow. He had not looked defeated when he left. He had looked decided. A sharper metallic click sounded above the western bleachers. Thomas Grant heard it this time. He rose and moved toward Marcus without waiting for an explanation. "What do you need?" he asked. "Start moving the first 3 rows toward the south exit," Marcus said. "Keep them walking. Do not let anyone run." Thomas nodded and turned immediately. Marcus reached the first row. "Folks, I need everyone in this section to stand and move south in an orderly line." A father with 2 children remained seated. "The manager said there is no emergency." "I know what he said," Marcus replied. "Take your children and move now." Behind him, Calvin spoke into the microphone, assuring the audience that the equipment had been inspected and asking everyone to remain calm. The father looked from Calvin to Marcus, uncertain which authority to trust. Then the light above them flickered. The young technician looked up as the western support cable slipped another fraction of an inch. A second fastener struck the floor near the bleachers and spun beneath an empty chair. The camera mounted at the outer edge tilted several degrees, pulling the frame unevenly toward the crowd. Thomas began guiding families out of the first row. Marcus raised his voice just enough to carry. "Western section, move toward the south exit. Stay together. Do not run." Natalie stepped away from the center of the mat, finally seeing what Marcus had seen. Calvin lowered the microphone as the cable gave another strained metallic sound. The lights flickered once more. Then the entire western lighting and camera rig shifted above the bleachers and gave a slow, visible shudder. The room fell silent. "Nobody runs," Marcus said as the western lighting and camera rig groaned above the bleachers. The music cut out. Calvin's microphone slipped from his hand and struck the floor. Chairs scraped in every direction as families stood too quickly. Children called for their parents, and the giant livestream screen flickered once before going black. The first danger hung above the western section. The second was already moving through the crowd. Too many people were pushing toward the same aisle. "Move south," Marcus called. "Keep your children with you. Walk, do not run." His voice carried through the confusion without becoming a shout. Thomas Grant took position at the center aisle and repeated the instructions, turning frightened families into a moving line. Marcus pointed toward the young technician at the control station. Cut main power and call emergency services. Tell them the western rig is unstable. The technician looked once toward Calvin. Now, Marcus said. The young man moved. Marcus turned to Calvin. Open the service access door beside the south exit. Calvin stood frozen beneath the dark sponsor banners. Then another strange sound came from overhead, and he hurried toward the door. Natalie remained near the mat, staring at a room that no longer had rules, a clock, or cameras telling her where to stand. Natalie, Marcus called. Her eyes found him. Take the children behind the blue wall pads. Keep them together. She nodded and began guiding the nearest group away from the western bleachers. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. A little girl stopped in the aisle, crying for her mother. Natalie turned back, took her hand, and led her into the line instead of continuing towards safety alone. Count them, Marcus told a father near the pads. Do not let anyone leave that group without an adult. The man began counting aloud. Marcus stepped onto the lowest row of the western bleachers and scanned the space. Sophie stood near the center aisle with his watch pressed against her chest. Several yards beyond her, Noah Wilson crouched beside a lightweight barrier that had folded across the walkway. He was unhurt, but the metal frame and its securing strap blocked the only clear path away from the western side. Marcus looked from Noah to Sophie. For 1 second, everything inside him stopped. Danielle's white hospital blanket. The promise on the calendar. She cannot lose both of us. A sharp metallic strain overhead became another sound from years earlier, radio static and a distant voice saying, "Bring them home." Marcus's hand moved toward the empty place on his wrist where the old watch should have been. "Dad," Sophie called. He looked at her. She saw the fear he never showed for himself. "Go help Noah," she said. "I know you'll come back." The noise of the room seemed to fall away around those words. Marcus pointed toward Thomas. "Sophie, go to Mr. Grant. Stay with him until I come back." Thomas reached her and placed one hand on her shoulder, keeping his body between her and the moving crowd. Marcus turned toward Noah. "I need 2 adults," he said. A father and a staff member stepped forward. "Hold the barrier steady. Do not lift until I tell you." Marcus retrieved the wrench from his toolbox near the railing and moved beneath the open side of the folded frame. He loosened the fastener holding the strap while the 2 adults kept the barrier from shifting. "Noah, look at me," Marcus said. The boy raised his head. "When I say move, crawl toward Natalie. She is waiting for you." Natalie had returned to the safe side of the aisle and lowered herself near the opening. "I've got you, Noah," she said. The main lights went dark as power to the rig was cut, leaving the emergency signs glowing red along the walls. Metal creaked above them. Marcus freed the strap. Now, the 2 adults raised the barrier only a few inches, enough for Noah to move beneath it. The boy crawled through the opening, and Natalie pulled him gently toward the blue wall pads. Marcus backed out last. The western section was nearly empty now, and Thomas kept the remaining families moving through the south exit. Calvin held the service door open while responders approached outside. Marcus did not look up for applause. There was none. Only heavy breathing, quiet crying, and sirens growing louder beyond. The building. He crossed the center aisle toward Sophie. She ran to him before Thomas could release her hand. Marcus dropped to one knee, checked her face, her hands, and the rhythm of her breathing, then wrapped both arms around her. "You came back," she whispered. "Every time," he said. Thomas watched Marcus hold his daughter as emergency crews entered through the south doors. The certainty in the older man's face had replaced every remaining question. He stepped closer and spoke quietly enough that only Marcus heard him. "Read 1." Marcus looked up. For the first time that day, his calm expression broke. "Nobody has called me that in years," Marcus said. Emergency crews entered through the south doors as Thomas Grant held his gaze. The name Read 1 hanging between them with a weight Sophie could feel even if she did not understand it. Marcus looked toward the remaining phones in the room, then at his daughter. "Not here." Thomas gave a small nod. Natalie stood nearby with Noah beside her, listening as responders moved toward the western bleachers. "What does it mean?" she asked. Thomas did not answer with a list of missions or honors. He simply said, "He was the man we sent in when everyone else needed a way out." Marcus's jaw tightened. Sophie looked up at him, not with awe, but with the quiet certainty of a child who had just watched her father keep a promise. Natalie's eyes moved from his worn maintenance shirt to the darkened mat where he had refused to embarrass her. "You could have ended that challenge whenever you wanted," she said. "Why didn't you?" Marcus looked toward the children gathered behind the blue wall pads. "I served," he said. "That is not what made me useful today." Natalie glanced at the damaged rig. "Then what did?" Knowing when the contest no longer mattered. The answer left her silent. Near the control station, the young technician handed the unfinished inspection form to a fire inspector and showed him an email sent earlier that morning about the added camera mount. Another staff member confirmed that Marcus had questioned the Western support before the event began. Calvin stepped forward, his face pale but controlled. "The visual inspection was nearly complete," he said. "I believed we had enough time to finish after the live stream. I did not think the frame was in immediate danger." The inspector asked him to surrender access to the control system, remain available for questioning, and preserve every message, form, and recording connected to the rig. A senior Harbor Point administrator arrived moments later and suspended Calvin's event authority, pending a formal review. No one placed him in handcuffs. No one announced that his career was over. The consequences had begun, but the truth would have to be documented. Calvin looked toward Marcus as though expecting anger. Marcus gave him none. "You were warned," he said. "You decided the warning mattered less than the show." Then he turned to the administrator. "Let every employee speak without worrying about losing a shift or a job." The young technician looked at Marcus with visible relief. Natalie waited until the responders had moved farther away before approaching Sophie. One of her assistants lifted a phone, instinctively framing the moment. Natalie reached over and lowered it. "Not this." She knelt several feet from Sophie instead of moving closer without permission. "May I talk to you?" Sophie looked at Marcus. He did not answer for her. After a moment, she nodded. Natalie kept her voice low. "I used your father to make myself look important. I brought you into it because I thought pressure would make him perform for the cameras. I looked at his clothes and his job and decided I understood him. I mistook calm for weakness." She swallowed. "I was afraid people were going to stop paying attention to me. But that does not excuse what I did." Sophie held Marcus's watch in one hand and her unfinished notebook in the other. "You looked at the camera before you looked at us," she said. Natalie lowered her eyes. "I did. My dad noticed Noah before the cameras did." "He did." Sophie did not say she forgave her. She only moved closer to Marcus and slipped her hand into his. Natalie accepted the silence without asking for anything more. Sophie looked up at her father. "You came back." Marcus closed his fingers around hers. "I told you I would." For an instant, his thumb brushed the worn initials DM on the back of the watch, but he said nothing about the name connected to them. Behind him, investigators photographed the rig, collected the inspection form, and began interviewing staff. Ahead waited Sophie's unfinished essay and the ice cream he had promised her that morning. Marcus picked up her purple backpack, and together they walked toward the south exit while Natalie remained behind, watching the cameras stay lowered. "Can I read mine now?" Sophie asked. 6 weeks after the Harbor Point charity event, she stood at the edge of the blue mat with her notebook pressed against her chest, while 20 children settled into a loose circle around her. Harbor Point had reopened under new management after every suspended structure, exit route, and safety procedure was reviewed. The investigation found that Calvin Price had ignored an incomplete inspection, discouraged staff from delaying the live stream, and placed the event above documented concerns. He no longer managed programs at the center, and the board required him to answer through the formal process rather than through public humiliation. Natalie Brooks had been offered help producing a polished apology video. She declined. Instead, she used the remaining event funds and part of her own savings to support a free Saturday program for children from single-parent homes. She also gave written statements protecting the technician and employees who had tried to report the unfinished inspection. Her change was not perfect or immediate. Sometimes her voice still sharpened when a student made the same mistake twice. Now, however, she stopped, lowered herself to the child's level, and tried again without turning embarrassment into a lesson. Natalie taught balance, discipline, and responsible self-defense. Marcus taught situational awareness, de-escalation, how to identify exits, and how to protect the person beside you without creating more danger. He had agreed to help under one condition. The children would learn how to avoid a conflict before learning how to face one. The words Daniel Mercer Strength Project appeared in modest lettering near the entrance. When Sophie once asked who Daniel was, Marcus told her only that he had been a good man Marcus had promised to bring home and could not. He did not say more, and she did not press him. Noah Wilson attended every session. That afternoon, he finished a balance exercise, looked toward Natalie for approval, and received a quiet nod instead of a camera. When class ended, Sophie walked to the center of the mat. Marcus leaned against the doorway in his gray maintenance shirt, his old watch resting against his wrist. Natalie stood near the wall with her phone put away. Sophie opened her notebook. The bravest person I know is my dad. I used to think brave people never got scared, but my dad says they do. They just remember who needs them. My dad knows how to fight, but he does not use people to make himself feel big. He helped Noah, even after people laughed at him. He helped Natalie, even when she was not kind. He notices when someone is afraid, and he always comes back. He used to serve in the Navy, but that is not the biggest reason he is my hero. He is my hero because he chose to stay and be my dad. Sophie lowered the notebook. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Marcus looked toward the floor and blinked once, then opened his arms. Sophie ran to him, and he held her against his chest while Natalie turned away just enough to give them privacy. Later, Marcus locked the center and found Sophie waiting beside the parking lot with 2 chocolate ice cream cones. One had already begun melting over her fingers. Evening light stretched across the pavement and softened the brick walls of Harbor Point behind them. Marcus took the Messier cone. That one was supposed to be yours, Sophie said. I am making a sacrifice. They started toward the car. After several steps, Sophie slipped her free hand into his. Dad, did you win that day? Marcus looked back at the building, then down at his daughter. We all got home, he said. That was enough. Sophie nodded as if the answer settled something important. Together they crossed the quiet parking lot beneath the fading gold sky, their joined hands between them and 2 melting ice cream cones leaving small drops along the wet